A passenger mocked a black CEO's child mid-flight, but when the father stepped in, the entire cabin went silent in shock. A passenger laughed while poking a baby with a pen. Thinking no one would stop his cruelty, he didn't realize the father was seconds away with a coffee pot ready to teach a lesson in instant justice. The moment the pen touched the child, chaos flipped in the cabin. Subscribe if you believe arrogance collapses the instant real strength shows up. The pen tapped once against the metal armrest with a click that felt louder than it should have been. Dr. Taryn Veller heard it, barely, but chose not to turn. He adjusted the soft edge of the bassinet where his 10-month-old son Corinne lay bundled, then calmly reached for his coffee with steady fingers. The plane had just leveled out, the subtle tilt of ascent easing into quiet pressure across the body. The hum of the cabin returned to normal, yet the air around seat 1C carried something colder. Across the aisle in 1D, a man named Jaron Meller leaned back with his legs spread, just enough to invade the personal space he hadn't been granted. His tie was already loosened, wine glass already half empty. And now, the pen in his hand, a capped one, black and metallic, rested lazily between his fingers like a tool waiting for provocation. Taryn didn't flinch when the pen tapped again. Another idle click against the seat divider. Jaron exhaled through his nose with a sound that resembled amusement, then said loud enough for 3 rows to hear, "They really let anyone in first class now, huh?" His words dangled in the air with fake innocence. Hope the little guy doesn't cry the whole way to Solvent. These mergers get tense enough without baby screams. Taryn turned his head slightly, not enough to confront, just enough to confirm the speaker's tone. He gave a brief, unreadable nod. Corinne stirred lightly beneath the blanket, but didn't wake. The engine's gentle drone vibrated through the floor, masking the discomfort that was beginning to bubble in Taryn's chest. Merrick Vale, the steward assigned to forward cabin, passed by at that moment. He gave Taryn a small, respectful nod, the kind given only to those with clearance or designation above a typical flyer. It wasn't showy, but it was noticed, especially by Jaron. Something changed in Jaron's expression. The lazy grin stiffened. His posture stiffened too, subtly, and he shifted in his seat like a man who just realized he wasn't the most important presence in the room. But whatever realization flickered across his face, it didn't reach his hands. The pen was still there. A few minutes passed. Taryn sipped his coffee. The windows showed high, clean skies. Corinne slept. Then the pen struck again, softly, but this time against the edge of the bassinet seat, near the baby's foot. Taryn's hand paused mid-sip. "Just keeping myself entertained," Jaron said, this time not bothering to hide the smirk. "Can't believe airlines allow kids this close to the front. Seems disruptive." He let the word hang, letting it carry an implied insult, while staying just beneath the surface of what could be formally reprimanded. Taryn placed the coffee cup back on his tray with precision. He turned, still calm, and said, "Please refrain from touching this area. My son is sleeping." "Didn't touch him," Jaron replied, casually. "Just the seat. Calm down." Behind Taryn, a middle-aged man in 2C shifted in his seat, subtly glancing over his shoulder. The tension was becoming a third passenger in the row. Then came the moment that would later play again and again in people's minds. Jaron leaned forward slightly. The pen, still capped, moved once more, and this time it nudged against the soft side of the blanket where Corinne's foot was tucked. The motion was deliberate, gentle but invasive, a line crossed not by force, but by suggestion. Corinne stirred again, this time with a whimper, and let out a tiny cry. Not loud, just startled. It lasted no more than 2 seconds before Taryn placed a hand gently on the bassinet and whispered to him. But in that moment, everything else ceased to exist for Taryn. He looked up. Jaron chuckled. "Relax, I was just checking if the little guy's real," he said, reclining again, sipping the last of his wine like a man satisfied with his performance. Didn't think it'd be such a sensitive issue. For a second, no one moved. A few passengers had turned now, eyes narrowed, not in shock, but in confusion. Was this real? Was this man seriously making a game of prodding an infant? Taryn spoke quietly, without emotion. Do not touch my son again. Jaren rolled his eyes. It's a joke. Don't be dramatic. But Taryn wasn't dramatic. He wasn't even angry, not yet. Instead, his mind moved somewhere else entirely. Somewhere disciplined. Somewhere structured. Without a word, Taryn stood up and adjusted the lapel of his blazer. He stepped past his seat and disappeared behind the curtain that led to the forward galley. Merrick noticed him pass, but didn't interrupt. Taryn's steps were calm, not rushed. In the galley, stainless steel caught the ambient cabin light. The hum of the overhead fan was a soothing white noise. Taryn reached for a silver coffee pot, one not in use, one sitting warm but idle on the shelf. It wasn't hot enough to scald, but it was heavy enough. He walked back just as quietly. Jaren didn't see him return. He was too busy refreshing his wine glass, laughing at something on his phone. Taryn stood beside him. "You've touched my child twice," he said, voice low and even. "I asked you once." Jaren looked up, confused, just in time to see the arc of the polished steel descending. But that part hadn't happened yet. Not yet. For now, Taryn simply watched as Jaren stretched lazily and the pen rolled between his fingers once more, like a conductor warming up before a show. Corinne stirred again, and Taryn's hand hovered gently over the bassinet in instinct. It began not with shouting, but with a smirk and a pen. Jaren Meller leaned forward without warning. The capped pen in his hand extended just far enough to tap the soft blanket covering the baby's leg, lightly, like a joke with a hidden edge. Corinne flinched, a small involuntary jerk, and Taryn Veller's gaze snapped downward. He said nothing at first. A moment passed. The cabin hummed with the dull quiet of cruise altitude. A few overhead fans, the occasional rustle of paper, the low clink of glass. Taryn's fingers gently rocked Corinne's carrier again, trying to soothe him back into a drowsy calm. He glanced once at Jaren, who was now sipping wine and looking out the window with an exaggerated yawn, as if nothing had happened. Taryn's mind raced, but his face remained composed. Maybe it had been accidental. Maybe turbulence had nudged Jaren's elbow. Maybe this was something that would pass if ignored. He didn't want to assume malice where there might have been clumsiness. But deep down, something coiled tight in his chest, a father's quiet warning system, tuned over months of interrupted sleep and long flights. The pen had been aimed. He knew it. Corinne stirred again, a small, sleepy whimper escaping his lips. Taryn adjusted the blanket. His hand hovered protectively near the bassinet as he whispered, "You're all right, little one." His voice was low, nearly inaudible. Jaren didn't look at him, but spoke just loud enough to carry across the aisle. "Hope he doesn't cry the whole flight." The sentence floated in the air like a sarcastic cloud. He chuckled, lifting his glass again. "Though I suppose they're good for building patience. Or ulcers." Taryn glanced at him. "He's usually quiet," he said, calm and flat, his tone designed to close the conversation. He turned back to Corinne, now gently rubbing the infant's side. Corinne settled once more, lulled by his father's voice. But the tapping started next, rhythmic, precise. Click, click, click. Jaren's pen caps struck the plastic divider between their seats. An idle noise at first, but it didn't stop. Over and over it repeated. Top, top, pause, top, top, top. A syncopated rhythm, just irregular enough to be annoying, just loud enough to be clearly intentional. Taryn looked sideways. Jaren's fingers danced the pen like a baton, his smile invisible but implied in the angle of his posture, the mock innocence of the act. Taryn breathed slowly. He unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned slightly closer, his voice quiet but firm. "Please stop." Jaren glanced over, eyes glazed slightly from wine. "Stop what?" "The tapping." "Oh." Jaren blinked, feigning confusion. Didn't realize it was bothering anyone. Just a habit. He let the pen drop into his lap. Didn't think ears would be this sensitive in first class. Taryn didn't reply. He nodded once and returned to Corinne, but his body was tense now, angled protectively toward the child. A full minute passed in silence. Then the pen returned, this time not to the divider. It arced forward and jabbed again, lightly but deliberately, toward Corinne's foot beneath the blanket. Terrence saw it this time. No turbulence. No accident. Jaren's wrist had flexed with control. Corinne gave a startled hiccup, a sharp sound that cut the air. Terrence's hand clamped gently over his son's legs, and his eyes met Jaren's squarely. Jaren leaned back and chuckled. Relax. I was just checking if the little guy's real, he said with a grin, as if he expected a laugh, as if this were some shared joke between strangers. You know, cute baby and all. No one laughed. The row behind them went still. A man folding a newspaper paused mid-crease. Another passenger, an older man near the window, lowered his phone and tilted his head toward the exchange. The cabin had not gone quiet, but the quiet around row 2 had deepened in an unmistakable way. Terrence stood. His movement was not rushed, not threatening, but there was purpose in the way he rose. The pressure in the aisle changed. Jaren blinked, his grin faltering just slightly. You've touched my child twice, Terrence said, voice low. Jaren shrugged, lifting both hands mockingly. It's just a joke. Don't be dramatic. The words hung in the air like smoke, mockery pretending to be humor, cruelty draped in politeness. At that moment, a male flight attendant approached. Merrick Vale, trim and clean-cut, came down the aisle, a clipboard in hand. He noticed Taryn standing, Jaren smirking, and the way several heads were now turned, watching. The silence told him everything. He looked first at Taryn, who nodded once, not for help, but to acknowledge the moment. Is everything all right, gentlemen? Merrick asked, posture upright, voice neutral. Jaren waved a hand lazily. We're fine. Man's just a little touchy about his baby. Taryn didn't move, didn't flinch. Merrick glanced at the nearby passengers. No one nodded. No one supported Jaren. The atmosphere had shifted, and the steward, perceptive from years in the air, understood immediately which man in this aisle commanded silent respect. I'll be nearby if needed, Merrick said, voice calm, but he lingered a beat longer than usual. Taryn sat down again, but this time with one arm cradling Corinne more securely, his other hand resting lightly on the armrest, closer now to the aisle. His eyes didn't leave Jaren's face for several seconds. He had measured the man, weighed the line that had been crossed. The baby stirred once more, then settled under his father's gentle hum. Taryn did not sing words, only tones, soft and warm, a melody not meant for the aisle or the passengers, but only for the small heart resting against his chest. In the row behind them, a man leaned forward just slightly, as if ready to intervene should anything happen again. But Jaren only took another sip of wine and reclined slightly, lips twitching into a grin, one that didn't reach his eyes. He had no idea who Taryn was, no idea what kind of patience he was pressing against. Dramatic irony swelled. Jaren, smug in his assumptions, believing this man was just another quiet father trying not to make a scene, not realizing that the line had already been drawn and crossed. But a father doesn't measure provocation in words. He measures it in how close a hand comes to his child. Taryn moved before anyone truly registered he was gone. One moment he was seated, calm and still, and the next he rose with the quiet resolve of someone not agitated but finished. He stepped down the aisle like a shadow drawn by instinct, not anger. His gait was measured, controlled, not a hint of trembling in his stride. He passed the curtain separating first class from the galley, his presence barely noticed by a flight attendant rearranging snack trays. The galley's chrome shimmered under the soft cabin lights. Rows of neatly stacked cups, sealed tea bags, and a silver coffee pot sat at the far corner, simple, untouched. Taryn's eyes settled on the pot. He didn't hesitate, his hand wrapped around the warm metal handle, lifting it with the ease of someone collecting a tool, not a weapon. The liquid inside sloshed subtly, warm, not scalding, but heavy with symbolic weight. He turned, silent, and retraced his steps back into the cabin, the pot held at his side. Passengers glanced up, drawn to the quiet tension threading through the air. It was the way Taryn carried himself that sparked attention, calm but intense, focused, the subtle sense that something unspoken had just shifted, Even the hum of the engines seemed to quiet in anticipation. Jaron Meller sat in his seat, reclined and lounging, as if nothing mattered. His lips were curled in that same smug half-smile that had been there since boarding. One leg crossed lazily over the other. A glass of wine, still half full, rested in the crook of his fingers. And in the other hand, like a trophy from a schoolyard taunt, was the same pen. He was still holding it. Taryn stopped in the aisle beside him, expression unreadable. Corinne's light whimpering had faded, replaced now by a fragile calm as the baby clutched a corner of his blanket in sleep. Taryn's voice was low, measured, deliberate. "You've touched my child twice," he said. "I asked you once." The words, so simple and composed, should have triggered recognition in any man. But Jaron laughed, not loud, just a breathy scoff through his nostrils. "You're joking, right?" he muttered, still smiling as he raised the wine glass to his lips. He didn't see the pot coming. In one swift, seamless motion, Taryn brought the heavy base of the coffee pot upward and forward in a controlled arc. The dull metallic thud echoed through the cabin as it met Jaron's nose, direct, decisive, and devastating. The crack was unmistakable. Cartilage gave way, blood bursting like a struck valve across Jaron's chin, collar, and the crisp white napkin on his lap. Jaron didn't scream at first. His body jolted, wine glass toppling and spilling red liquid down the seat and his pants. For half a second, he froze, stunned, eyes wide with disbelief, as if trying to process how the world had changed in one heartbeat. Then the pain caught up. He roared. The sound was ugly, high-pitched, desperate. One hand flew to his face, the other still clinging to the pen. Blood poured through his fingers, pooling onto his shirt and dripping to the floor. His legs thrashed, knee hitting the seat in front of him as he cried out, "You lunatic! You broke my—" The flight attendant from earlier, Merrick Vale, ran forward. A ripple of movement passed through the cabin as passengers sat up, turning, some gasping, some silent. But none rushed to intervene. Taryn didn't move. He stood exactly where he had delivered the blow, holding the coffee pot now upright, like a seal of judgment. His breathing was slow, steady, not a drop of blood on him. Corinne began crying, a soft, confused wail from the bassinet seat. Taryn turned slightly, stepping toward his son. He lowered the pot carefully onto the tray table and reached for the baby's blanket, adjusting it gently, murmuring something only Corinne could hear. The child's cries softened. He soothed his son with the same hands that had just delivered what looked to be surgical retribution. A young man in the aisle seat 3 rows behind slowly raised his hand. "I saw it," he said to Merrick. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from clarity. He told that man to stop. Twice. The guy kept poking the baby, then laughed when the kid cried. Another passenger, older and suited, nodded. He was poking with a pen. It wasn't an accident. Jaron was now wheezing, trying to stand, but a sharp stab of pain kept him down. Blood stained his knuckles, and as he writhed, the pen finally slipped from his hand, clinking softly to the floor. It rolled under the seat, forgotten. Taryn remained seated beside Corinne, who had now fallen back into a soft slumber. Merrick opened his crew radio and reported, medical and security on standby at arrival gate. Civilian injury. One involved passenger under control. He glanced at Taryn, paused, and added, "No restraining necessary." The intercom came alive with the captain's composed voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced an onboard disturbance. All is under control. Please remain seated and allow the crew to manage the situation. Thank you for your cooperation." The quiet that followed was thick. Not just silence, but reverence. A line had been crossed, and another had been drawn in response. Jaron, once the loudest man in the cabin, now whimpered quietly beneath a blood-soaked napkin, his body curled and broken in a mess of arrogance and pain. His smirk had vanished. His wine glass was shattered, and the pen, the thing that started it all, had disappeared from sight. Taryn sat back, brushing a thumb gently across Corinne's cheek. His eyes stayed forward, face unreadable. But inside, the message had already been written. The cabin went silent, as if the coffee pot had declared something more powerful than words. The coffee pot struck with a sharp, metallic thud, silencing the cabin in an instant. Jaron Meller's head snapped back against the seat as his wine glass toppled to the floor. Blood gushed from his nose in wild pulses, spilling onto his crisp button-down shirt and pooling across the lowered tray table like spilled ink across a page. His fingers flew to his face, but the damage was already done, bones shattered, dignity erased. He let out a guttural, animal-like cry, high-pitched and panicked, more from the shock than the pain. Taryn Veller didn't move. The coffee pot, still warm but not scalding, remained upright in his right hand. His eyes were calm, too calm. In his left arm, Corinne whimpered softly, sensing the storm in the silence. The father didn't flinch, didn't speak. His face was unreadable. It wasn't rage that had moved him. It was something colder, something weightier, judgment. Merrick Vale arrived almost instantly, having sensed something erupt before it did. He froze at the scene, blood, gasps, a broken man clutching his face, and Taryn standing like a statue holding the most unassuming weapon imaginable. The steward tapped his earpiece and spoke low but clear. Code Garnet. Medical and ground protocol. Confirm immediate relay. Notify co-captain. His training kept him focused, but his pulse spiked. This wasn't in the manual. Around them, passengers began stirring. No one screamed. No one lunged. A strange aura had settled over the first-class cabin, a solemn, almost reverent quiet, like witnesses at a courtroom revelation. A man in his mid-50s, seated just behind Jaron, slowly lifted his hand. I saw it, he said firmly, addressing Merrick. His voice carried. The guy kept poking the baby. I thought it was a mistake the first time, but he did it again. And he laughed. The man turned slightly, looking at the others. He touched the child. More than once. Another passenger across the aisle, a young man in business attire, nodded and added. He asked him to stop. Calmly. Twice. Merrick scanned the crowd. There was no uproar, only quiet clarity. The passengers weren't defending the man bleeding. They were explaining why he bled. Taryn slowly set the coffee pot down on the galley cart beside him. The clink of metal meeting steel echoed louder than expected. Then, he shifted Corinne gently to his lap, pulled a wipe from the pack hanging by the bassinet, and began cleaning the child's hands and face with care. Corinne had stopped crying. His eyes searched his father's face for answers he was too young to ask. Taryn's touch remained delicate, his hands steady, as though the past moment hadn't happened at all. Jaron, meanwhile, squirmed in his seat, alternating between howls and curses muffled by blood and tissue. Merrick leaned down just close enough to keep control. You will remain seated, he said sternly. Medical will be waiting. Do not speak again unless asked. Jaron glared at him, but his body shrunk under the scrutiny of everyone watching. He suddenly looked less like a provocateur and more like a petulant child caught vandalizing something sacred. In the cockpit, the captain's voice broke the silence. Ladies and gentlemen, there has been a security-related medical incident in the forward cabin. Please remain seated. Authorities will meet the aircraft upon arrival. It was simple, measured, but every word carried weight. Taryn didn't look up. He reached into his satchel for a clean cloth, adjusted Corinne's blanket, and held him with a care so profound it stood in stark contrast to what had just unfolded. Merrick returned to the galley, speaking softly into his headset. Confirmed. No threat to flight. Respondent is a protected clearance. No cabin-wide escalation. Requesting confirmation on ID protocol upon ground arrival. Dramatic irony soaked the scene. The man everyone had presumed was simply a calm, well-dressed father had just broken another passenger's nose, and no one, not even the crew, moved to restrain him. In fact, they seemed more interested in what would happen next. Taryn turned finally to Merrick and asked, voice steady, "Could I have another wipe for the seat?" Merrick blinked, then nodded. Yes, of course. He handed it over without hesitation. As Taryn gently cleaned the armrest and wiped away a small droplet of blood from Corinne's carrier, the passengers continued murmuring, not about Taryn, but about Jaron. He poked a baby, someone whispered. More than once. Laughed when the kid cried. He warned him, another added. No one said he shouldn't have hit him, because by then it was understood. It wasn't a hit. It was a response. The engines hummed beneath the floor as the aircraft began its descent. Outside, the clouds parted to reveal the glint of tarmac far below. Inside, the mood shifted from shock to reflection. Something more had just happened than a simple altercation. Something institutional. Something symbolic. Taran didn't speak again. He looked down at Karen, ran a hand gently over his son's fine hair, and closed his eyes for a moment, gathering thoughts not of violence, but of balance, of consequences, of silence and what breaks it. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered to their seatmate. He didn't even raise his voice. And another, that wasn't anger. That was a verdict. As the wheels prepared to touch down, Taran adjusted Karen's hat, reclined slightly, and rested his hand on the bassinet's edge. The pot beside him gleamed under the cabin light, still upright, calm. Because sometimes a broken nose is only the beginning of the consequences. The wheels screeched softly against the tarmac, and the aircraft jolted slightly as it completed its descent into Solvin International. Passengers sat in stiff silence, some craning their necks toward the front of the cabin. The quiet buzz of relief that usually follows landing never came. Instead, all eyes remained on the man seated in 3C DR, Taran Veller, cradling his infant son as if the rest of the cabin didn't exist. And across the aisle, slumped under a crimson-streaked cloth and the weight of his own arrogance, was Jaron Meller, barely conscious, bloodied and broken. The jet bridge aligned with a low hiss. The cabin door unlatched with a heavy clunk, and the sterile light from the terminal spilled into the forward compartment. Through the open doorway, paramedics in Navy jumpsuits rushed in, wheeling a stretcher between rows. One crouched to Jaron's level, checking his pulse while muttering into a shoulder mic. Another carefully lifted his arm, now limp and streaked with dark red. His face, wrapped hastily in gauze, leaked through in blotches, evidence of the force behind that single, deliberate blow. Taran didn't speak. He merely adjusted Karen's position against his shoulder and stared ahead as if time had slowed. But he noticed everything. The second paramedics glanced toward him, the way the captain exchanged a low whisper with Steward Merrick Vale, and the stiff approach of two uniformed airport security officers just beyond the threshold. One officer stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to remain on board for debriefing," he said evenly, his tone straddling caution and command. "There was an incident, he knows," Merrick interrupted, stepping between them with the same professional calm he'd carried throughout the flight. In his hand was a sleek, sealed folder bearing the crest of the Federal Ethics Oversight Commission. The security officer raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" "Identification confirmation," Merrick replied. "You might want to read it before you proceed." The captain, standing just behind them, took the folder and flipped it open. Silence fell again, this time colder, heavier. The second stretched as he read the enclosed file, his brows slowly lifting. Then, softly, "A federal arbitration officer." Taran gave a single nod. "In air conduct, passenger rights oversight, Tier 1 clearance," he said simply, his voice level, unthreatening, but unmistakably final. The murmurs began again, this time not in suspicion, but in stunned recalibration. "The guy with the baby," someone whispered from row 5. "He's flight ethics?" Another voice chimed in. "That explains the steward's nod," he knew. Security stiffened, visibly reprocessing the scene. Their hands moved subtly away from the cuffs they had half-clenched just seconds earlier. One of them muttered, "We were told to prepare for an onboard assault case." Taran, still seated, slowly reached into the breast pocket of his blazer and produced his official ID wallet. With his free hand, he opened it to reveal the embossed federal seal and credentials. "I'll cooperate fully," he said, his tone calm as glass. "But I acted within parameters of proportional response. My son was touched, twice, after clear verbal warnings." The captain handed the file to the security officer, who took it without comment, reading swiftly. Meanwhile, Merrick spoke to the other crew members in low tones, instructing them to begin collecting statements. It didn't take long. The man seated behind Terrence stood up and addressed the officers. I saw everything. That guy, Meller, he kept poking the baby with a pen. Wasn't an accident. He did it multiple times. Smirked while doing it. Another passenger, 2 rows back, chimed in. Taryn told him to stop politely. He didn't. Then he did it again, and the baby cried. One more, we all heard it. He said, "You've touched my child twice. I asked you once." Then it happened. Within 10 minutes, 4 passengers had offered to sign written statements. 2 provided video clips from their phones, showing the moments before the incident. None portrayed Taryn as aggressive. All captured the deliberate, smug provocation and the sudden, surgical response. Meanwhile, Jaron, now fully strapped to the stretcher, was wheeled past the captain, his wine-stained shirt clinging to his chest, the gauze blotched like a war wound. His eyes darted around frantically. "He attacked me," he sputtered, voice nasal and muffled through swelling. He went nuts, but the officer escorting him had already seen enough. "You'll have a chance to speak after we file the full report." Back on board, the cabin had softened into a reverent hush. Not fearful, curious. Moved even. No one rose to defend Jaron. No one questioned Taryn's composure. One of the security officers turned back toward him, holding the folder. "Given your position, we'll review this immediately. But from what I see so far, it seems you didn't break protocol." He looked toward the blood-stained pen still resting on the tray table, untouched since the incident. "You enforced it." Taryn didn't respond. He merely adjusted Corinne's blanket, smoothed it gently, and looked out the small oval window as the morning sun edged above the tarmac. And suddenly, the coffee pot was no longer just metal, it was precedent. The moment Taryn stepped off the aircraft, the atmosphere at Gate 27 changed. The buzz of General Airport chatter dimmed as eyes turned, not to the man, but to the quiet command with which he carried himself. Corinne stirred gently in his carrier as Taryn adjusted the strap across his shoulder, one hand still gripping the small travel bag, the other steadying the child without urgency, without hesitation. The crew who had witnessed the incident stood back, as if instinctively aware that whatever had just happened on board was no longer within their authority to handle. A tall man in a black blazer approached with measured steps. "Dr. Veller," he said, extending a hand. "Marcus Dren, liaison from Airport Ethics Command. We've been briefed in real time." His handshake was firm, but not performative. Taryn returned the gesture, his expression unreadable but calm. Behind Marcus, a discreet team of airport security agents lingered, not for Taryn, but to escort and receive the injured passenger who had provoked a storm with a pen. As they moved toward the private debrief area, Marcus handed Taryn a secure tablet. Footage is already syncing to the federal ethics oversight cloud. 3 passenger clips, crew cam, and aisle dome. This one, he paused, tapping the screen. This one is going to go viral. The clip was clear, uncomfortably so. Jaron Meller's pen jabbing forward, not once, but multiple times. The second jab, aimed at Corinne's tiny foot, coincided perfectly with the infant's flinch and whimper. Taryn's calm voice followed, captured in crystalline audio. "You've touched my child twice." Then the silence before impact. The coffee pot did not swing wildly. It struck with the precision of someone trained to act when words failed. "I didn't want escalation," Taryn said flatly, eyes still on the screen. "I waited. I warned." He smirked. Marcus nodded. "The smirk is what breaks public patience. You'll see. By morning, this won't be about the pot. It'll be about what that pen represented." Taryn didn't reply. He knew how symbols took hold, especially when pain was captured on video and silence framed it like a courtroom. Within 2 hours of touchdown, the clip leaked. No press release. No whistleblower. Just a private aviation ethics forum that had once hosted Taryn for a podcast titled The Third Boundary, when ethics meets emotion in midair. The moderators recognized him instantly and uploaded the footage with a headline that struck the internet like a match on fuel. "Passenger poked baby with pen. Ethics officer responded with coffee pot justice." By 6 a.m., the clip had been reshared over 20,000 times. Comments poured in, split into camps at first, some outraged by violence, others demanding context. The context arrived when the forum moderators added side-angle footage from another passenger. In that clip, Jaron could be heard laughing, saying, "Relax, I was just checking if the little guy's real," followed by gasps and Taryn's still, deliberate voice. There was no yelling, just a line crossed, then a consequence delivered with the weight of parental instinct and federal authority combined. In parallel, Jaron Meller tried to seize control of the narrative. His legal counsel issued a press statement calling the incident a disproportionate act of violence against a fellow passenger. They insisted charges would be filed, lawsuits prepared, and damages pursued. But the investigators assigned to the case weren't so easily swayed. When they dug into Jaron's travel record, something surfaced. 1 year earlier, another flight, another complaint, another passenger who had filed a report against him for aggressive verbal harassment involving an infant. The case had been quietly closed after the victim declined to press charges. But the probation warning remained on record. This wasn't just an isolated act, the lead investigator said to his team as he watched the Arvin jet footage for the third time that morning. It was a pattern until someone finally responded. Jaron's complaint was thrown out before it even reached formal channels. No prosecutor wanted to be seen defending a man whose prior behavior showed a consistent pattern of hostility toward children, especially when the public narrative had shifted decisively. Taryn wasn't seen as a violent man. He was seen as a silent line drawn in flesh and stainless steel, the kind of father others wished had been on their flight when a line was crossed. Back in his hotel suite, Taryn laid Corinne gently into a travel crib, the baby already asleep, unaware of the storm his presence had stirred in the skies. The tablet still buzzed with updates, mentions, interview requests, opinion pieces forming. He ignored them all. Instead, he pulled a leather-bound notebook from his bag, sat by the window, and began to write. Not for a press statement, not for a memoir, just for clarity. For Corinne. The last thing he jotted that night was a note to himself. If a pen can be used to provoke, then let a pot stand for restraint. Let both be recorded. Outside, a plane took off, its blinking lights crossing a dark sky already filled with quiet turbulence of a different kind. Somewhere, the footage continued to circulate, changing conversations in homes, on flights, in boardrooms. But Taryn didn't need to watch it. He had lived it, and he had made sure the response wasn't just reaction, but record. This wasn't just an isolated act, the investigator tells his team. It was a pattern until someone finally responded. News of the incident had not even cooled before it ignited a national conversation. It began with a silent upload. A short video, taken from a passenger seated 2 rows back, showing the moment Taryn Veller spoke the now viral words, "You've touched my child twice," followed by the unmistakable crack of justice delivered by a silver coffee pot. The footage spread fast, not through tabloids, but through ethics forums, travel safety accounts, and then unexpectedly, parenting networks. The clip was raw. No music, no commentary, just a clear moment of decision. And that clarity struck a nerve. Within 48 hours, civil rights advocates, airline unions, and parent associations were weighing in. Some called it assault. Most called it the enforcement of a long-ignored boundary. A prominent fatherhood organization posted a statement reading, "This wasn't rage. This was the moment a line was drawn where none existed before." One by one, airline staff began chiming in, often anonymously, posting under aliases in private forums. Stories of being told to de-escalate quietly, even when witnessing blatant provocation against families traveling with infants. A quiet storm brewed in the industry. Taryn saw none of it, not at first. He spent those days away from news, away from social media. While the world debated his intent, he drafted, not for the cameras, but for policy. In a quiet corner of his study, beside a crib where Corinne now slept soundly, Taryn outlined the document that would become a new chapter in airspace regulations. He titled it plainly, Proximity Protocol for In-Flight Minors. The memo was not written in anger, but precision. It began by defining physical boundaries around infant seats based on research-backed proximity sensors already embedded in most modern aircraft seating. It recommended a tiered response system: verbal notice, staff intervention, then immediate passenger relocation if violations persisted. But the heart of the memo wasn't technical, it was human. It read, "Infants cannot speak for themselves. Therefore, the first line of response must never be silence." Each page of the document balanced ethical enforcement with actionable crew guidelines. Not once did he mention his own incident. Instead, he filled it with examples from flight data, past complaints, and behavior patterns that had previously been dismissed as harmless. He ended the memo with a single line italicized in bold: "Respect, when not reinforced, is permission withdrawn too late." At first, he sent it privately, through encrypted channels, to 2 airline consultants he had mentored in the past. No press, no publication, just policy. But 2 days later, an unmarked envelope arrived at his office with the airline's seal embossed in gold. Inside was a formal invitation. The executive board of Arvanjet requested a closed-door presentation. Not a media event, a meeting with decision-makers. Terran arrived dressed in gray, not to fade, but not to posture. The boardroom was sleek, its walls lined with airframe schematics and projected data on route optimization. The board members were all male, their ties loose from a long day, but their expressions tight with curiosity. They'd seen the video, but what they wanted was the man behind the policy. "Dr. Veller," the chairman began, "we've received your document. Thorough, quiet, but I must ask, why send it to us directly and not through legal?" Terran placed a small folder on the table. "Because legal waits for something to break. Ethics prevents it before it cracks." The room was silent. He continued, his voice calm but not cold. "What happened on Flight 713 is not about me. It's about a pattern. Passive aggression toward families, especially those who don't match the expected profile in first class, isn't just discomfort. It's degradation dressed in civility. It erodes trust in your cabins before the seatbelt sign is off." One board member leaned forward. "Are you asking for a zero-tolerance policy?" "I'm asking," Terran said slowly, "for a proximity standard that defines the space around a child as a protected boundary. Not because the child is weak, but because dignity is learned first from how the world responds when they cry." Murmurs followed. Someone mentioned lawsuits. Someone else nodded toward future-proof branding. But one younger executive, silent until now, spoke up. "You didn't file charges against the man who provoked you." Terran nodded. "Justice is not vengeance. It's clarity." The boardroom fell into thoughtful silence. No objections, only shifting priorities. As the meeting concluded, the chairman extended his hand. "You've given us something to build on, Dr. Veller." Terran shook it once. "I never wanted to become a symbol," he said quietly, eyes momentarily drifting to the window where planes lifted into the dusk. "I only wanted my son left alone." The passenger smirked, certain his prank would go unpunished, unaware that every movement, every smirk, and every second had been noted by a father who doesn't tolerate threats to his child. When the coffee pot swung, the cabin froze in disbelief. If you believe cruelty under a uniform or privilege always folds when power meets precision, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Jared Meller's face was still swollen when the clip hit 300,000 views. The video, shaky, unedited, caught from a passenger 2 rows behind, captured everything. The slow provocation, the father's stillness, the warning, and finally, the swift, brutal slam of the coffee pot into Jaren's nose. No dramatic music, no camera cuts, just reality unfiltered. And yet, the internet didn't need embellishment. It needed a symbol, and it found one. The pen. The same capped pen Jaren had used to jab at a baby's foot was now frozen mid-motion in thousands of screenshots, still frames, and memes. One viral caption read, "The pen that crossed the line." Another featured a photoshopped courtroom sketch where the pen stood trial, gavel in hand. And in a particularly popular parody, a lion cub sat in a plain seat with the line, "He poked the wrong pride." From a dimly lit clinic room, Jaron tried to keep up. The bandages on his face itched under the heat of the camera lights. A small podcast crew, the only one still interested in his side, set up 2 mics and a phone camera. One of them, a greasy-haired producer named Brent, asked, "You sure you're ready to say it like this? People eat it up if you just hint it was, race-based." Jaron blinked, unsure if it was the painkillers or the reality that stunned him more. "I'm the victim," he muttered. "He hit me." Brent grinned. "Exactly. So let's roll with that." The podcast episode aired under the clickbait title, "When Ethics Goes Too Far, Victim of Coffee Pot Assault Speaks Out." But it didn't land. Comments flooded the channel, none in his favor. "You poked a baby and got roasted. Sit down. Play stupid games when coffee pots." The dislikes outnumbered views within hours. Back in the quiet hills just outside Winlow City, Taryn Veller hadn't seen any of it. He didn't care to. While Jaron spiraled into internet infamy, Taryn spent the week with Corinne among tall pines and firefly-lit fields. His laptop stayed closed most days. When he did open it, it was to write, not posts, not responses, but chapters. His next work? Airborne Ethics for the Next Generation. The final chapter bore a title written without hesitation: How to Stand Without Raising Your Voice. Taryn wrote by the stream, while Corinne napped beside him. He wrote in silence, in clarity, in peace. The incident hadn't shaken him. It had clarified him. Every paragraph in the chapter flowed with the same calm force that had driven him to act. Not rage, not theatrics, just a line drawn and kept. But far from the forest, changes were already in motion. The airline, in quiet consultation with its ethics board, enacted a rule with almost no publicity. It had a dry name on paper, In-Flight Minor Harassment Prevention Clause. But crew began calling it something else almost immediately: the Coffee Pot Clause. The rule was simple. Any passenger found deliberately antagonizing an infant, especially after warning or report by a parent or guardian, could be relocated to the rear cabin. No questions, no appeals, no explanations needed. A supervisor named Darvin Rome, reviewing the rule in a training session, chuckled. "So basically, poke a baby, lose your seat." His colleague replied dryly, "Or your nose." The policy rollout was subtle but firm. Flight crews received updated pamphlets on proximity harassment behavior, including examples like tapping, mocking, and encroachment of minor passengers. What had once been ignored, joked about, or dismissed as overprotectiveness was now classified under Tier 2 provocation. The guideline included a shaded box titled, "Escalation Path if Verbal Warnings Are Ignored." In the margin, someone had scribbled in pen, "He asked once." Across social media, dramatizations exploded. Actors recreated the flight incident with exaggerated flair. One popular sketch featured an actor playing Jaron yelling, "He's just a baby," moments before getting dramatically clobbered with a teapot twice his size. Another, subtler version played it straight. No laughs, just a father warning quietly, then responding decisively. Both versions ended the same way, with viewers silently nodding. Comedians joined the fray. In one late-night monologue, a host quipped, the guy literally poked a sleeping lion cub and was shocked when the lion used the beverage cart." The audience roared. The laughter was loud, but the message beneath it wasn't lost. Still, Taryn remained absent from the noise. He wasn't hiding. He was choosing silence as a discipline. Each morning, he walked with Corinne strapped to his chest. Each night, he drafted training protocols for internal use. No public signatures, no press release. He didn't want to be known for the pot. He wanted to be remembered for the line. In one email to the airline's ethics division, he wrote simply, "I believe the lesson was never about the coffee pot. It was about how long a father waits to speak." That line, someone would later say, changed the department's entire approach. At the ethics division's office, a junior analyst named Kieran Dorn printed the email and pinned it above his desk. Underneath, he wrote, "Let the silence speak, but only until it's no longer safe." Meanwhile, Jaron tried to recover whatever was left of his life. He hired a new lawyer, filed a civil suit, claimed emotional distress, social defamation, long-term facial trauma. But the court's response was swift. Footage was reviewed, patterns uncovered. A previous complaint from a flight a year prior, different airline, same behavior, surfaced. The judge, a stern man named Cortland Yar, closed the folder slowly, looked at Jaron, and said, "Mr. Meller, your own actions built your reputation. No one else lifted the pen." The ruling barely made a ripple. But Taran didn't need ripples. He only needed one moment, one action, to be remembered as a shift. Later that same week, the internal company memo circulated, highlighting the updated training protocol for conflict de-escalation around minor passengers. At the bottom of the document was a single unofficial note from the lead HR officer, typed in bold italics. And suddenly, everyone remembered what happens when a father says nothing until it matters most. The final twist came without warning. Taran Veller was walking Corinne through the quiet, frost-tinted park near his home when his phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. Corinne had just fallen asleep on his chest, snug in the carrier, and the winter light was soft and peaceful. But the notification bore the seal of the Congressional Subcommittee on Civil Aviation Conduct. The subject line was brief: request to appear, testimony on in-flight ethics reform. He didn't blink. He simply exhaled. 2 weeks later, Taran stood behind a modest oak-paneled desk inside the congressional hearing chamber. The room wasn't packed, but the men present had influence that reached every airport terminal in the nation. A single microphone blinked red before him. Corinne rested quietly in the front row carrier, watched over by an aide. Taran adjusted his dark cufflinks, looked up calmly, and began to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice composed, unwavering, "we train crew for turbulence, but not for human cruelty. That gap must close." A stillness spread through the room. Senator Dorick, chairing the session, leaned in slightly. "Mr. Veller, you exercised force in a high-pressure environment, yet witnesses say you acted with restraint until provoked repeatedly. Why wait?" Taran looked toward Corinne, then back at the panel. His eyes didn't flicker. "Because every father's first instinct is peace," he said quietly. "But our second is protection." A hush followed, contemplative, not uncomfortable. What began as a fact-finding hearing soon turned into a policy reckoning. One by one, lawmakers asked questions not just about the incident, but about the silence that surrounds the treatment of infants and their guardians aboard commercial flights. Taran laid out data, not drama. Years of silent reports filed, crew undertrained for subtle passenger aggression. Airlines focused more on profits than proximity violations. He spoke of unseen turbulence, the kind inflicted not by weather but by unchecked behavior, smirks that escalate, jokes that jab. He outlined the absence of any clear regulation defining spatial boundaries around minors. "A baby's seat," he explained, "doesn't come with the dignity of distance unless we name it." By the end of the session, the panel was visibly moved, not only by Taran's logic, but by his measured tone. There was no anger, no blame, just the quiet authority of someone who had seen a line crossed and dared to draw it publicly. The legislative language that followed was swift. It was called Corinne's Line, a clause defining a physical boundary zone around minors on flights. It mandated reactive crew training, real-time sensor logs on proximity disruptions, and immediate passenger relocation in the event of provocations. There were provisions for onboard de-escalation specialists and a flagging system for repeat boundary offenders. Though dry on paper, the clause carried an unspoken weight. It was the first regulation that acknowledged the passive cruelty sometimes inflicted on traveling infants and their guardians. After the hearing, 2 offers followed. The first came in the form of a sleek envelope from the Office of Transportation Ethics. A federal appointment. Full authority over airborne conduct standards. Prestige. Power. The second was less formal, a quiet call from the operations lead at Skyfront Airlines. "We'd like you to train our people. Not with rules, with clarity." Taran didn't hesitate. He turned down the federal title. Instead, he accepted the quiet path, one of behind-the-scenes reform. He began drafting new internal playbooks for crew on how to defuse escalating behavior before it reached confrontation. He worked directly with airline leadership to shape new training videos. He created internal simulations, case studies anonymized, but every steward knew which one was based on Flight 713. In private interviews, Taran declined to recount the incident in detail. "It wasn't about me," he said. "It was about the silence we all let grow until someone did something too loud to ignore." The reforms took root quietly. Even as media coverage softened and moved on, the policy began influencing seating assignments, crew behavior, and passenger briefings. His name never appeared in the credit lines. He didn't want it to. In the quiet of his study one night, after another video call with a flight operations team halfway across the country, Taran glanced at a framed image of Karen, still just a baby, asleep under a knit hat, nose pressed against his father's chest mid-flight. He whispered aloud, not to himself, but as if responding to a world still catching up. "Because one broken nose is nothing," he said during a private interview, "compared to the silence that breaks families every day. And sometimes the loudest justice is brewed in silence." Taran Veller opened the message without hesitation. The subject line was plain: no sender ID, no formatting, just 3 words: "Thank you, sir." The body contained a single sentence: "I didn't know we were allowed to act without shouting." No signature, no context, just those words. He stared at the screen for a long time. The morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of his study, warming the polished floor, but Taran's posture remained still. His hand hovered near the keyboard, as if one misplaced keystroke might unravel the balance he had spent 6 months rebuilding. And yet, this wasn't the first message. It was one of hundreds. Some were typed in caps, as if urgency alone could restore dignity. Others were long, confessional, aching with delayed clarity. But this one, it struck different. Short, quiet, true. Karen's giggle from a nearby playpen broke the trance. Taran turned, watching his son clap his hands at a soft toy giraffe. The memory of that flight, the pen, the smirk, the pot, flashed like a silent slide in his mind. He didn't need reminders. He carried the details like they were part of his own DNA now. Later that afternoon, a notification blinked from a private server channel, one he never joined but had been monitoring discreetly. The line holders, what had started as a quiet telegram thread among a few fathers, had grown into a digital gathering of men across the country. No laudes slogans, no violence, just training, stories, and stillness. Their motto was adapted from his own hearing testimony. First instinct, peace. Second, protection. Taran scrolled through the latest updates. A man in Oregon posted a video of himself practicing measured responses to passenger harassment, using a pillow and voice modulation drills. Another, a widowed uncle in Vermont, uploaded a short clip of his nephew sleeping in a bassinet with the caption, "He's safe because I'm learning." Taran said nothing, posted nothing, but bookmarked the video. He wasn't their leader. He never wanted to be. But whether he admitted it or not, his name hovered in every strategy post, every citation, every mirrored analysis of the coffee pot response. They used his full transcript as foundational reading. They referenced his courtroom phrasing like scripture. "You've touched my child twice. I asked you once." That evening, a logistics manager named Renhalis messaged him directly, one of the rare requests Taran allowed through. Ren didn't ask for advice. He simply wrote, "I stopped a man from swearing at a crying toddler. Just stood between them. I didn't say much. He backed off. Then, thanks for proving we could do that." Outside, dusk settled over the city skyline. The world moved on. But inside airports across the nation, quiet shifts were taking place. Travel safety ads began replacing cartoon mascots with a more subtle image. Just a baby, peacefully sleeping under a dim blanket, lit only by a soft overhead light. No logos, no eslogans, just a single line in small, bold print. "Respect begins here." Those who knew, knew. Taran noticed it for the first time during a layover in Montreal City. He had stopped to use the restroom, Karen asleep against his chest in a sling, when he saw the ad displayed across 3 digital panels above the check-in counters. No mention of him. No need. Just that still image of a baby and the reminder it carried. A younger agent behind the desk glanced at Corinne, then at Taryn, and smiled. "First time flying with him?" he asked. Taryn smiled faintly. "He's flown before." The agent nodded slowly, but something in his eyes hinted at recognition, not of the man, but of the moment. He said nothing else. Neither did Taryn. By month's end, the line holders had begun quietly developing regional chapters, not for patrols or activism, but for presence. They practiced stillness, trained in tone, ran simulations with passengers pretending to provoke. And they did it in gyms, garages, and empty church basements, out of sight and without ceremony. Taryn, at home, continued his quiet work. He updated his ethics modules, drafted new de-escalation protocols, spoke at one closed-door seminar under a pseudonym. And when asked why he had never trademarked the coffee pot clause, he replied, "Because it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to whoever stands without shaking when they've asked twice and been ignored." One morning, as Corinne napped, Taryn received another message. This one included a photo, grainy, black and white, clearly printed from an old phone. It showed a small group of men standing in a circle around a stroller in what looked like a school gym. They weren't holding weapons. They were holding paper cups and notebooks. In the center was a quote scribbled on a whiteboard. "Let silence become the warning." Taryn downloaded the photo, archived the message, and turned back to his work. That evening, he walked with Corinne down the river path near their home. The child laughed at birds. Taryn breathed in the chilled air. As night fell, he paused under a street lamp and whispered, not for the world, not for justice, but for his son, "You won't remember this. But I do, and I always will." Corinne blinked up at him, reached for his hand. And in that quiet sleeping face, the world was reminded of what lines must never be crossed. The door to the event hall opened without ceremony, revealing a long, glass-paneled boardroom bathed in cool, diffused light. Taryn Veller stepped inside, holding his breath, not from anxiety, but from curiosity. He had received the invitation 2 days earlier, a discreet, handwritten card from the Arvanjet Executive Board inviting him to a private post-incident review and consultation. He expected procedural formality, perhaps an apology, maybe even a token gesture of recognition. But the atmosphere in the room told a different story. Around a polished obsidian table stood a dozen men in suits, executives, trainers, legal advisors. They did not speak as he entered. Instead, they turned as one and nodded with solemn respect. At the far end, a tall, gray-haired man with a trimmed beard stepped forward. His name tag read Chairman Howrick Tenner, though his demeanor suggested he didn't care if Taryn remembered it. "Dr. Veller," Howrick said, offering a firm handshake. "Thank you for coming. Please, this way." The room dimmed as the lights lowered automatically. A screen descended behind them. No one had asked Taryn to sit. Instead, he was guided to a central, standing position as the screen flickered to life. It began with a single image, the Isle of Flight 713. Then, the footage rolled, not the full chaos, but a curated narrative. There was Jarameller leaning, pen in hand. The cap jabs. The second poke. Taryn's stillness. His quiet rise. The galley. The coffee pot. The return. A pause. Then the critical frame. Taryn standing beside Jaren, holding the pot, uttering the now famous words. "You've touched my child twice. I asked you once." The moment slowed, the impact muted but evident. The replay didn't glamorize, it clarified. The sequence played out not as an act of violence, but of finality, a response to a line crossed too many times. When the screen faded to black, a quote emerged in elegant serif font. He asked once. The lights lifted again. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Howrick cleared his throat. "Dr. Veller, that footage and the full incident has been reviewed not just by our board, but by our ethics consultants, flight safety division, legal risk team, and federal liaison office. All have concluded the same thing." Taryn raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" "That the system didn't fail," Howrick said, "but it waited for a passenger to do what protocol should have prevented." Another man, broad-shouldered, ex-pilot by the look of him, stepped forward. He tapped a tablet and activated a new slide on the wall, a digital logo reading Guardian Protocol. Beneath it, mandatory for all long-haul flight crews, effective immediately. This, he said, is the new module, the Guardian Protocol, built from your actions, your restraint, your exact phrasing, your timing, your control. Taryn's gaze narrowed. I wasn't aware I'd become a training module. The man smiled, not without guilt. You didn't, but your choice became the case study. He continued, guiding Taryn toward a wall display. On a central plinth stood a glass case. Inside it, carefully centered on a velvet base, sat a silver coffee pot. Not the original, a replica. Engraved beneath the handle were 3 words in bold black etching: boundary, dignity, response. Beside the case, Merrick Vale stood with arms folded, nodding slowly. His face had aged in a month since the incident, but his eyes gleamed with recognition. He stepped forward, extending his hand. I've worked 2 decades, Merrick said softly, and never seen justice look like that. The room remained still, as if the silence itself was part of the tribute. Taryn didn't speak for a moment. His fingers gently brushed the glass case. The pot inside was clean, perfectly polished, never used, but heavy with meaning. It wasn't just an object anymore. He turned to the group. You're building policy from pain, he said, from a moment no one should have let escalate. Howard nodded. And yet, here we are, turning it into prevention. Taryn's face softened. Then make sure no one else has to lift the pot to make a point. A crew trainer stepped up. The final module ends with this clip, he said, tapping again. The screen returned briefly, no footage this time, just a slow zoom, the coffee pot being returned gently to the galley counter. A hand steady, deliberate, then fade to black. The quote appeared once more. He asked once. The courtroom fell into a stiff hush as Jaron Meller rose, flanked by 2 sharply dressed attorneys who seemed far more polished than their client. He adjusted his collar with one hand. The other was still recovering from the surgery needed after the break. The suit looked expensive, but the face behind it carried a bruise that no fabric could hide. The case had been filed under civil defamation, and Jaron's team had leaned heavily into the narrative that he was maligned by the media and physically assaulted without warning. Taryn Veller didn't attend. He didn't need to. The footage had already spoken louder than any witness testimony. 3 camera angles. The pen taps. The child cry. Taryn's calm warning. And then the strike. Not in rage. Not in chaos. But with an exactness that no lawyer could reframe. When the judge entered and took his seat, the air felt taut with inevitability. Papers shuffled. Spectators whispered. The lead attorney for Jaron began with practiced emotion. This is a case about perception, your honor, about how one man's overreaction ruined another's future. The judge didn't blink. He waited, listened. Then, 20 minutes in, he raised a single hand, cutting the lawyer off mid-sentence. Mr. Meller, he said, his voice measured, I have reviewed the footage. I have read the passenger testimonies. I've studied your prior conduct, including the warning issued to you for a similar incident last year on Elvin Jet Flight 221. He paused. Your own actions built your reputation, Mr. Meller. No one else lifted the pen. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The gavel struck once, sharp, final. Case dismissed. Outside, the media barely blinked. The world had moved on. But in quiet corners of policy offices, airline boardrooms, and ethics advisory groups, something else was stirring. The consequences of that flight were far from over. They had only just begun to ripple outward. In a dim office filled with the soft scratch of a fountain pen against parchment, Taryn signed the final page of his manuscript. The soft rustle of Corinne's breathing monitor hummed in the background. No fanfare, no publishers pacing outside his door. Just a single lamp casting a gentle pool of light on the manuscript title. The third ask, Ethics, Boundaries, and What Follows Silence. He didn't read over the final sentence again. He knew it by heart. He had lived it. The coffee pot had been in action, yes, but it had also been a boundary etched not in policy, but instinct. The manuscript was uploaded to his publisher that evening under quiet terms. No promotion, no tour. Yet within days of its release, it quietly rose through the leadership charts. Corporate executives passed it around. Airline instructors folded its insights into training packets. Private forums debated its core question: how far can silence stretch before it fractures into justice? Taran declined every interview. Instead, he focused on the small but relentless stream of letters that arrived weekly now. Fathers, uncles, older brothers, writing not to praise him, but to confess moments when they hadn't acted. Moments when they stayed silent, hoping the situation would de-escalate, hoping the disrespect would stop on its own, hoping wrong. One letter had said, "I thought being calm was enough. Now I know calm doesn't mean still." Another, "Your coffee pot became my boundary. My boy slept through a trip he would have cried through, if not for your example." Taran read every letter, replied to almost none, but he kept them all in a box labeled The Line. At the Civil Aviation Commission's quarterly summit, new training materials were quietly introduced under a module titled Child Passenger Ethics. Phase 1. It included the term passive-aggressive child harassment, once dismissed as too vague to be enforceable. Now it was protocol. Flight attendants began receiving updated training to identify micro-provocations toward minors. Pin pokes, seat nudges, sarcastic commentary, and unwanted proximity. The reforms didn't reach headlines, but they reached crew manuals. That was enough. On the passenger side, online forums began echoing a different kind of wisdom. Posts warned, "Don't end up like Jaron Miller. Respect the seat beside you." The phrase wasn't shouted, it was whispered, quoted, reposted. It appeared on stickers, digital signatures, and even the underside of a travel mug sold quietly on an ethics awareness site. But Jaron himself? He vanished from public life. The attempted lawsuit had cost him. His employment contract with a media tech firm was severed under conduct unbecoming. He tried pitching podcast interviews. One obscure outlet took him, but edited the segment so clumsily that it backfired. He was memed, mocked, reduced not even to a villain, but to a warning. In a last attempt at regaining public favor, Jaron posted a long online essay titled The Misunderstood Passenger. It garnered 17 comments. Most were sarcastic. One simply read, "The third ask was the pot." Taran, meanwhile, remained silent through it all. He spent most mornings walking Corinne through the neighborhood park, bundled in a soft blanket, the boy's hand curled around his father's finger. Few people recognized him now. Fewer still spoke of the flight. Yet Taran remained watchful, not out of fear, but principle. Boundaries weren't about anticipation. They were about readiness. And readiness, he had learned, could change everything. On a cool Thursday afternoon, he sat beside a quiet lake with Corinne sleeping in his lap. His phone vibrated. A notification, new policy revision approved. Infant proximity enforcement standard, effective immediately. He locked the screen without reading more. The wind brushed through the trees. A father nearby leaned over and asked, "You that guy from the plane?" Taran didn't answer, just smiled, adjusted Corinne's blanket. The man nodded slowly. "Thanks," he said. Taran simply replied, "Protecting a child shouldn't require a spotlight." As the man walked away, Taran whispered the final lines of his manuscript to himself, not as a statement, but a reminder, a promise. The first ask is mercy. The second is warning. The third is the coffee pot. And between each, a line thicker than law, etched in instinct. The boy tugged gently at his father's hand. His tiny fingers curling around Taran's coat seemed like a whisper trying to speak. Taran Veller didn't say a word. He stood still, his gaze locked on the sliding glass doors of Gate 27. Nothing had changed. Same brushed metal benches. Same signage above the boarding lane. Same gentle hum of announcements echoing off the windows. But to Taran, this wasn't just a gate. It was a line. And a line, once crossed, never truly vanishes. Corinne, now walking with the steady waddle of a curious toddler, looked up at the glass pane, unaware of the weight it carried. Taran slowly knelt beside him, the knees of his pressed slacks brushing the tiled floor, the leather strap of his satchel sliding down his shoulder. He placed a hand gently on Corinne's back. "You won't remember this," Taran whispered, his voice soft but grounded. but I do, and I always will. Behind them, a janitor in navy blue uniform pushed a mop cart across the terminal floor. His pace slowed slightly as he passed, eyes flickering with recognition. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once, low, respectful, and moved on without pause. Taryn acknowledged it with a barely perceptible tilt of his head. It was enough. Words weren't needed between men who had seen the same footage and understood what it meant. The airport was quieter than usual, midday lull between flights, but the air still carried that unique scent of jet fuel, recycled air, and anticipation. Taryn let it settle over him. He didn't rush. Not this time. Corinne, fascinated by the blinking lights outside the window, pointed toward a taxiing jet in the distance, his hand smudging the glass slightly. Taryn stood again and followed his son's gaze, his reflection merging with the child's in the window. Father and son, two silhouettes staring out at the machines that once bore a very different kind of storm. That night, back at home, Taryn sat in his study beneath a dim brass lamp, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards. His hands moved slowly over the paper. No email, no keyboard. Just ink. A letter addressed, not to any agency, not to any headline, but to a future that would one day need remembering. To fathers who were once silent, the words came slower now, deliberate. Each sentence was carved, not written. Taryn wrote about that flight, not in detail, but in spirit. About the moment he realized silence could become its own violence if left too long. About the choice between peace and permission. About a pot of coffee that was never about heat, but about heat withheld. About the pen, the line, the child. He paused only once while writing, when Corinne stirred softly in the next room. Taryn listened, waited, and when the silence settled again, resumed writing. The final line took the longest. It wasn't for the commission, the court, or the press. It wasn't even for Corinne yet. It was for every man who had once clenched his jaw, bitten his tongue, and called it wisdom, only to feel his son's dignity slip away drop by drop. Taryn capped the pen and folded the letter with care, placing it into a stamped envelope he addressed to himself for future publishing. Not now, not yet, but someday, when it would matter most. He set the envelope on the mantel beside the replica coffee pot gifted to him by the airline. The engraving gleamed faintly in the lamplight. Boundary. Dignity. Response. Outside, the wind tapped gently against the windows, and Taryn stood by the glass again, just as he had at the airport. Corinne's footprints from earlier still marked the wooden floor. Tiny, scattered, curious. Taryn followed them in his mind and knew they would lead to questions someday. Questions about what happened on that flight, and why his father stood up only after the second ask. But tonight, those questions would rest. Corinne tugged at his hand again, this time pulling him gently toward the living room window. He had woken, eyes wide, holding a toy plane. He pointed once more, this time toward the sky itself. Taryn looked down, then lifted his son slowly into his arms. The weight was different now, not just physical. Legacy was heavier than bone. Together, they stood at the window, two shadows watching the night. And as Taryn looked ahead, not just out but forward, he whispered again, not to Corinne, but to time itself. And from that day forward, the line was no longer invisible. It had a name, a witness, and a pot of coffee beside it. In a heartbeat, the father's strike broke the attacker's nose, leaving the crew and passengers stunned. The lesson was clear. No one threatens his family without facing immediate consequences. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with speed, precision, and unstoppable force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, cruelty, and the courage it takes to protect loved ones under threat. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage accountability, integrity, and respect in all situations.